Hello and welcome to this evening's Equine Health Week talk. I'm here with David Rendle from the British Equine Veterinary Association, and we are here to talk about worm resistance. So, first of all, David, what actually is worm resistance?
Okay, hi Rachel, good evening. I guess worm resistance is no different from antimicrobial or antibiotic resistance, and I think everyone is fairly familiar with that concept and how important it is. If we use drugs against worms or bacteria too often, they find mechanisms to survive those treatments. So through genetic selection, essentially, every time we treat with something, we remove those members of the population that can be killed by the drug, and we leave behind some that have genes that allow them to survive. And those survivors breed with each other until we end up with a population of worms or bacteria where the drugs just don't work anymore. And that's where we're already at, really, with the wormers that we use in our horses, and similarly with some types of antibiotics, which obviously is a big concern in human health. But worm resistance often gets overlooked, or did until recently, but actually, as far as a threat to our horses goes, it's a much bigger threat than antibiotic resistance.
And why is it then such a problem?
Because we've got very limited options for worming horses, deworming horses. We're not likely to get any new ones soon. The cost of developing new drugs is huge, and the equine market is relatively small. So it doesn't really justify, unfortunately, the research and development to bring out new classes of drug, even if there were obvious ones available. And to be honest, there aren't huge numbers of obvious choices. So we have to make the best of the drugs that we've got. We've only really got 4 or 5 different types. I know there's lots of different brands available, but often it's different companies making the same drug. So we've only got 4 or 5 different types, and we've got resistance to all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on which parasite we deal with. So once we get to a position where none of them work, we've obviously got no way of treating our horses. And we already are faced with a situation where people think that drugs work and they don't, and then horses get sick or worse. So yeah, it is something that people really do need to take a lot more seriously than they do currently. If you've got a yard of horses and you've got resistance on that property, then that's going to affect you commercially as well. If you're operating a livery yard or a stud, particularly, some of those properties are starting to run into problems.
And so what are some of the health problems that you might get then if your horse it has parasites and these are resistant and you can't get rid of them?
Depends a bit on the type of parasite. The parasites that we're most concerned about, because there's the most resistance within them, are either the cythostomins or the small red worms or the small round worms. It all means the same thing. They're the ones that are the biggest problem for adult horses. They cause weight loss, diarrhea, and potentially death if they're there in large numbers. They're the ones that have insisted larvae that then burst out in the winter, spring, and can cause fairly sudden deterioration and death. The other type of parasite that's a problem for foals or young stock up to a year, maybe a little bit more of age, typically foals, are the ascarids. There's a lot of resistance to ascarids, particularly around some of the big stud areas. They're quite big parasites. They get quite big within the intestine. They can block the intestine and cause colic, which potentially requires surgery. So again, they can cause a fatal colic. They also migrate through the lungs, and they can actually cause quite severe, sometimes respiratory signs or lung damage as well.
And so, horse owners, what can we do then instead of treating our horses with these wormers to try and prolong the life that we've got with them?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You sum it up brilliantly. The less we use them, the more we can prolong their activity. Every time we use them, we're reducing the amount of time we've got, essentially, that they're going to remain effective. So we need to reduce the amount we use them to as little as possible, but obviously we don't want to risk our horses getting sick because we're not worming them. So the best way to go about doing that is to be monitoring worm eggs in their feces, so doing worm egg counts. So every time you would think about using a wormer previously, do a worm egg count. And we know from the loads and loads of studies that 8 times out of 10, you wouldn't actually need to worm. You could just do a worm egg count. So if we can reduce the amount of wormer that we use by 80%, then that's going to dramatically increase the amount of time that these drugs are going to work for. It's going to reduce the selection pressure. So you need to work with your vet to develop a plan for the year, which is going to be slightly dependent on the property that you've got. The nature of the property, the types of horses, the amount of movements on and off is going to determine the details of the plan. But in principle, you're going to be worm egg counting 3 or 4 times probably during the grazing season. And then depending on the type of horse and the risk, you're probably going to be treating with something at least once a year. But these are all discussions to have with the vet, because I know everybody wants a one-size-fits-all worming program, but those days are gone. And we should never really have been going down that route anyway, because we need to minimize the treatments that we're giving, and that can only be done by tailoring it to each specific property and looking at the specific risk factors on that property.
And I've seen things about antibody testing and blood testing. Is that also an option for some types of parasites?
Yeah, definitely for some types of parasites, it certainly has its place. The saliva test and blood test both are looking at antibodies. What they do is they look at exposure to the parasites. They don't necessarily tell us how big the parasite burden is at that point in time, but factored in with the background information that you've got and the advice of your vet, that can allow you to make a more accurate decision on whether you need to treat or not, give you a better idea of what parasites are present in the population and in roughly what sort of numbers. So they are potentially useful. Yeah.
And are there any other like practical management things that we could be doing on our yards?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's loads of management things we can be doing to reduce the need for using chemical treatments. Reducing the stocking density. So if we've got less horses on the property, there's going to be less parasites there as well. Making sure feces is picked up once or twice a week will obviously remove a lot of those parasites and reduce the levels that accumulate in horses. Making sure we quarantine new horses that are coming in to prevent them from bringing in resistant parasites, and making sure we treat them with an appropriate product as they come in. Again, speak to your vets about the most appropriate option. Varies a little bit depending on the age of the horse. Being careful about how you manage your grazing. Grazing with other species, sheep, for example, because they will eat the horse parasites and vice versa, and they won't survive in the other species. So that's a good way of cleaning up your pasture. So absolutely, we know full well that good pasture management is way more effective than using chemical treatments anyway. So that's really important.
And are there any sort of, obviously we're using these chemicals and putting them into the environment, is that a consideration?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And it's coming more and more to the fore as we realize the level of environmental damage some of these chemicals can cause. Most of the work has been done in farm animals, but the compounds that we're using in horses are often the same, or they're from the same class. We've got an increasing amount of work now looking at the avermectin, so the ivermectin, moxidectin type drugs, which we use very commonly in horses. We know that they will kill dung beetles and other invertebrate life. There's been studies showing that where those drugs are used regularly, you get a dramatically reduced diversity of dung beetles and other insect life. And if those chemicals are in feces, which they inevitably are after horses are treated, they will stay active in the environment, killing insects in the environment for, I can't remember the exact period of time, but it's a long time. I want to say months. It's certainly many weeks. So they can have quite a sustained effect in the environment. If they get into watercourses, that can be really nasty because they are extremely toxic to aquatic invertebrates. So we have overlooked that in the past, but I think as we're all looking more towards sustainability, trying to encourage biodiversity on our properties, that is a really big issue.
That's great. Well, thank you, David. Is there anything there that I missed that you might want to slip in here at the end?
No, I think that was brilliant. I would just reiterate that I think everyone should be trying to generate an annual plan for their property for parasite control. So if they haven't got one, go and speak to your vet and get one. Just speak to them for advice. They're not going to charge you for it. Just get a plan in place to maximize the protection of your property and your horses going forward.
Well, that's brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I hope everyone's had a really informative evening there, and go out, speak to your vets, get this sorted. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us for Equine Health Week, and there'll be plenty more coming tomorrow.